Hi friends, I Vilas. The members of my group are Spandana, Abhishek, Shivprasad, Pawan. We have prepared this PPT based on theme Triumph of Surgery. The author of this lesson is James Herriot. James Herriot born on 1916. James Herriot is pen name of James Alfred White, a British veterinary surgeon and writer. He is best known for his semi-autobiographical stories, often referred to collectively as All Creatures, Great and Small. He mainly wrote stories for animals and was known to refer to them as his little cat and dog stories, in which he describes with great simplicity his love for animals. Tricky, a small dog, is pampered by his mistress. She overfeeds him and he falls seriously ill. What happens to him? Does he recover? I was really worried about Tricky this time. I had pulled up my car when I saw him in street with his mistress and I was shocked at his appearance. He had become hugely fat like a bloated sausage with a leg at each corner. His eyes bloodshot and dreamy, stared straight ahead and his tongue lolled from his jaws. Mrs. Pamprey hastened to explain he was so listless, Mr. Herriot. He seemed to have no energy. I thought he must be suffering from malnutrition. So I have been giving him some little extras between meals to build him up. Some malt and cod liver oil and a bowl of Horlicks at night to make him sleep. Nothing much really. And did you cut down on the sweet things as I told you? Oh, I did for a bit, but he seemed to be so weak and I had to relent. He does love ice creams, cakes and chocolates, so I can't bear to refuse him. I looked down again at the little dog. That was the trouble. Tricky's only fault was greed. He had never been known to refuse food. He would tackle a meal at any hour of the day or night. And I wondered about all the things Mrs. Pamprey hadn't mentioned. Are you giving him plenty of exercise? Well, has his little walks with me as you can see, but Hodgson, the gardener, has been down with lumbago, so there was been no ring throwing lately. I tried to sound severe. Now I really mean this. If you don't cut his food right down and give him more exercise, he is going to be really ill. You must harden your heart and keep him on a very strict diet. Miss Pamprey wrung her hands. Oh, I will, Mr. Herriot. I am sure you are right. But it is so difficult, so very difficult. She set off head down along the road as if determined to put the new regime into practice immediately. I watched their progress with growing concern. Tricky was tottering along in his little tweed coat, dropping in his harness. I thought it wouldn't be long before I heard from Mrs. Pamprey. The expected call came within a few days. Mrs. Pamprey was distraught. Tricky would not eat anything, refused even his favorite dishes. Besides, he had bouts of vomiting. He spent all his time lying on a rug, panting. Did not want to go for walks, did not want to do anything. I made my plans in advance. The only way was to get Tricky out of house for a period. I suggested that he to be hospitalized for about a fortnight to be kept under observation. The poor lady almost fainted. She was sure he would pine and die if he did not see her every day. But I took a firm line. Tricky was very ill, and this was the only way to save him. In fact, I thought it best to take him without delay and followed by Mrs. Pampry's wailings. I marched out to the car carrying little dog wrapped in a blanket. Out on the road, I glanced down at a pathetic little animal gasping on seat by my side. I patted the head of and Ricky made a brave effort to wag his tail. Poor old lad, I said, I think I know a cure for you. At the surgery, household dogs surged round me. Tricky looked down at noisy pack with dull eyes and when put down lay motionless on the carpet. The other dogs, after sniffing around him for a few seconds, decided he was an uninteresting object and ignored him. I made up a bed for him in swarm use box next to one where the other dogs slept. For 2 days I kept an eye on him, giving him no food but plenty of water. At the end of the second day he started to show some interest in his surroundings, and on the third day he began to whimper when he heard the dogs in the yard. When I opened the door, Tricky trotted out and was immediately engulfed by Joe, the greyhound, and his friends. After rolling him over and thoroughly unexpecting him, the dogs moved off down the garden. Tricky followed them, rolling slightly with his surplus fat. Later that day, I was present at feeding time. I watched while Tristan dropped the food into the bowls. There was usually headlong rush followed by the sounds of high-speed eating. Every dog knew that if he fell behind the others, he will have some competition for the last part of his meal. When they had finished, Tricky took a walk around the shining bowls, licking casually inside one or two of them. Next day, an extra bowl was put out for him, and I was pleased to see him jostling his way towards it. From then on, his progress was rapid. He had no medicinal treatment of any kind, but all day he ran about with the dogs, joining in their friendly scrimmages. He discovered the joys of being blown over, tramped on or squashed every few minutes. He became an expected member of the gang, fighting like tiger for his share at the meal times and hunting rats in the old hen house at night. He had never had such time in his life. All the while, Mrs. Pampry hovered anxiously in the background, ringing a dozen times a day for the latest bulletins. I was able to tell her that the little fellow was out of danger and convalescing rapidly. The word convalescing seemed to do something to Mrs. Pampry. She started to bring round fresh eggs, 2 dozens at a time, to build up Tricky's strength. For a happy period, my partners and I had 2 eggs each for breakfast, but when the bottles of wine began to arrive, it was to enrich Tricky's blood. Lunch became ceremonial occasions with 2 glasses of wines before the several during the meal. There were days of deep content, starting well with the extra egg in the morning and finishing luxuriously with the wine. It was temptation to keep Tricky on as a permanent guest, but I knew Mrs. Pamphry was suffering after a fortnight. Felt compelled to phone and tell her that little dog and recovered and was awaiting collection. Within minutes, about 30 feet of gleaming black metal drew up outside the surgery. The chauffeur opened the door, and I could just make out the figure of Mrs. Pamphry, almost lost in the interior. Her hands were tightly clasped in front of her. Her lips trembled. Oh, Mr. Harriet, do tell me the truth. Is he really better? Yes, he's fine. There is no need for you to get out of the car. I'll go and fetch him. I walked through the house into the garden. A mass of dogs was hurtling round and round the lawn, and in their midst, ears flapping, tail waving, was little golden figure of Tricky. In 2 weeks he had been transformed into a lithe, hard-muscled animal. He was keeping up well with the pack, stretching out in garden bounds, his chest almost brushing the ground. I carried him back along the passage into the front of house. The chauffeur was still holding the car door open, and when Tricky saw his mistress, he took off from my arms and tremendous leap and sailed into Mrs. Pamphry's lap. She gave a startled "oh" and then had defended herself as he swarmed over her, licking her face and barking. As the car moved away, Mrs. Pamphry leaned out the window. Tears shone in her eyes. Her lips trembled. Oh, Mr. Harriet, she cried, how can I ever thank you? This is a triumph of surgery. Written by James Harriet. Thank you.